Albert Einstein once said that all religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. As today's technology and global risks race ahead of our understanding and stretch the boundaries of humanity, we face unprecedented ethical conundrums. I believe that reaching beyond the sciences and religion to that third branch, the arts, offers essential insight into these challenges. I call ethical decision-making on the borders of humanity ethics on the edge. We all teeter on the edge. How do we define a life well lived in a partly virtual world? Where do we look for moral guidelines and truth when curated selves befriend each other through algorithms? How do we make conscionable decisions in the uncharted territory of civilian space travel, designer genetics, and artificial intelligence? And what about the problems that are still on the ethical edge but shouldn't be, such as inequality or racism? Please join me in conversation with some of the world's leading artists and arts world pioneers as we explore some of today's most challenging ethical questions through the lens of the visual and performing arts, architecture, and literature. Sarah, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here and a great pleasure as well. Before we start with some of my ethics-focused questions, you started out performing at a remarkably young age. So can you just give us a little bit of some of the highlights about how you started your career?
I started really young. So the violin sort of came into the picture when I was 4 years old. And I started going to the Juilliard School when I was 6. So already at that stage, you know, just being at Juilliard every week and being surrounded by such astronomically talented colleagues, I mean, that really motivates you more than anything else. And then I made my big debut with the York Philharmonic when I was 8 years old, and that sort of snowballed everything, and the rest of my career just sort of followed, and it hasn't really let up since. So,
well, how one gets to Juilliard at 6 and then simply 2 years later, let alone at the ripe old age of 8 years old with the New York Philharmonic, we'll come back to. But it's extraordinary to have started so young and to have had what I would call relentless success since then. What do you think is the role of the arts, whether it's classical music or literature or architecture or any of the arts, in influencing the ethics of a society in their time or for subsequent generations?
I think there is a definite role for the arts. And when I say the arts, I mean classical music, opera, ballet, as well as paintings and sculptures and of course, you know, literature. And I also think that if you just sort of follow history and the ups and downs of the economy of any country that you were in, the arts and the support of the arts and the flourishing of the arts, you know, also followed that sort of mountain with the peaks and the valleys and all that great stuff. So I think there is definitely a correlation. I also think that as somebody in the arts, we do have a definite responsibility to not just go on stage and do our thing and jet off to the next city and just continue, you know, rinse, repeat, and just do that every single day. But to actually stand up for something, you know, and have a voice, and whether that's politics, whether that's children, education, arts organization, whatever it may be, to at least have one focus and to make sure that it isn't such a self-serving profession. Because if you're not careful, you know, you become so involved in your own little bubble, and you're so busy and everything is just so stressful all the time that you forget the big picture sometimes. And I think it really is important as artists on the circuit.
So at what point, since you did start so young, at what point did you start to realize this responsibility as an artist, and at what point did you start to become aware of the potential for the arts to influence the ethics?
I think the very first time I was struck, literally like a bus like hit me, was when I had a performance in North Korea. And my family is from South Korea. My grandparents came from the north, and then they both came to Seoul to go to college, and overnight the border went up, so my grandparents never got to see their parents after that. So my parents were born in Korea, in South Korea, and I was born in the US. So it's very layered, and I have my own feelings about the North and South situation in Korea, but my grandparents, just listening to them talk about it, you know, they would get very emotional about it, and I could see that it meant a lot to them. So I did go, and it was an astonishing experience, unlike anything else I've ever done. It is very much of a closed-off society still to this day, and we're talking like 20 years ago when I went. But I did realize for the very first time during that concert, you know, with all these issues going on and all these diplomatic and political issues going on with the North and the South, here I am, and I'm a South Korean American kid with South Korean parents, and I'm standing on this North Korean stage with a mixture of the South Korean and the North Korean orchestra, you know, and we're performing. And if it's possible on one stage, if it's possible for us to rehearse together, work together, and create a concert together on one stage, why can't it be a bigger stage? And why can't it somehow just spread and hopefully lead to, you know, talks and hopefully a better situation? So I think that was the first time that I realized that music can be utilized as a sort of soft tool in a diplomatic and in a cultural diplomatic way.
We certainly see with music in other parts of the world. We see with Daniel Barenboim's Divan Orchestra.
Yes.
So it's fascinating to hear what you're saying about North Korea, because that's really an example that we rarely hear. Where do you look for inspiration for your own ethical principles? Is it family? Is it other musicians? Is it religion? Is it somewhere else in society? Where do you look for your sense of where true north is and the principles that guide how you're going to make your own decisions?
For me, on a personal level, it really does stem from family more than anything else. I grew up in the U.S. With fairly strict Asian parents, you know, and anyone who grows up in a mixed sort of household will understand what that means. But, you know, I had fairly old-fashioned, very traditional parents, and I'm very, very grateful for the values that they instilled in us. And, you know, starting from speaking Korean at home, you know, respecting your elders the way that, you know, the Asian tradition always does. Every time that, you know, I would either go on stage, have a concert, every time we had a photo session, every time I had a record cover, you know, session, whatever it was, you know, not only did I have to be happy, my mom had to be happy, my dad had to approve, and they also wanted to make sure that, you know, we're in the classical music industry. We understand that everyone has their demographic, but at the end of the day, is this something that you want your grandparents to see? And that's sort of what I base my barometer on. You know, if I do a photo shoot, if I do any sort of, you know, magazine cover, CD cover, whatever it may be.
That's a great question. Would you be proud to have your grandparents see it?
Exactly. Would I be okay if my grandfather looked at this? And if the answer is sketchy, then we X'd it out. And it took me a while because at the beginning of my career, I was so young and I had my parents, I had various managers, and of course, you know, your publicist and just so many people and assistants and so many people surrounding you and helping you, but nobody actually tells you at that stage when you're starting your career out that you actually can say no. You know, so at the beginning of my career, there were actually, you know, photos and articles and, you know, et cetera, things that came out that I actually did not know that I actually could say, hey, you know what, I'm not okay with that. You know, can we X that out? Can we strike this one? And then it was only later when I realized, you know, it's okay to say no. It's okay to say, you know what, I don't like this photo. You know, I'm not okay with this. You know, it felt good at the time, you know, when we had the photographer there and the entire team there.
But on reflection?
This photo of me lying on a couch in a skimpy dress has nothing to do with Brahms. It has nothing to do with Beethoven. So let's strike it, you know, and it was later on that I felt, you know, that it was okay to say no.
I think what you just said would resonate in so many different ways. I think many in other industries, for example, bankers, could all benefit from a lesson early in careers that, you know, you actually can say no.
Yeah.
But I think also what you're saying resonates so much with what's happening today with women and the global discussion around sexual harassment and sexual assault. So I think that's an incredibly important comment. Was there a point at which you felt that your Korean grounding with your family values really did conflict with what you were living as a young person growing up in the US?
I think, if anything, having that sort of multicultural upbringing helped, you know, when it came to having my career and traveling and being on the road and being a young professional at the time. If anything, if there were any conflicts, you know, with the parents and, you know, with the whole cultural clash, you know, it was probably just being a teenager.
Right.
And just being a teenager and going to school. And I went to a wonderful, wonderful private school where we did not have to wear uniforms, which for me was a big thing. And in retrospect, maybe if we had, uniforms, maybe it would have, caused a lot less fighting every morning. But, in a way, things like that, where all your friends are doing one thing or another and your parents aren't quite ready to allow you to grow up at that speed. And I was still at an age where I didn't have a cell phone until I was at least 17 or 18. There was no email at the time. So if I wanted to talk to a boy, that meant he had to call my home and my mom would answer.
Right.
So like things like that,
So
and
parents were running interference.
they were, and if a boy called, they would just hang up on him. And now we don't have to deal with that because now we have cell phones and we text each other, and so things
No, that's
are
true.
different
Young people
now.
are living in a very different, much
different
more
world.
independent environment.
It's independent and I think a bit more dangerous as well.
Very much so.
Yeah, and less control that the parents may have, which I think is probably not that great. But you would hope that, kids, with their parents' influence would make the right decisions for themselves.
But it's true that today's parents may try very hard, but technology can help the children do an end run around the parents in many cases. If we could talk a little bit more about how you integrate ethics into your own work, both from a musical standpoint and from some of your extra musical activities. So from the musical side, in the research, I did a lot of reading about how committed you are to the composer's intention. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. That in and of itself is a performance ethos. And on the non-musical side, I understand that you've been appointed a cultural ambassador by the U.S. State Department.
Yes.
So if you could talk a little bit about that role as well.
Yeah, of course. So I think as a musician, especially as a soloist, I think our number one priority should be the most honest messenger of the composer that you possibly can be. I think it's important to, of course, put your own personal stamp on every single piece that you perform on stage. But the first thing that you should always have in your head is what would the composer, what did he want? What is it that he wanted? And 9 times out of 10, everything that you're looking for is in the music. Most composers were incredibly detailed. Some didn't care.
Like who, for example?
Some just wrote the notes and said, here, embellish where you want. Vivaldi, for example. Vivaldi Four Seasons, you will never ever find 2 recordings that are exactly alike because he gave you a lot of freedom. He wrote the outlines of the notes and basically said, here is basically the skeleton of what I want you to play, and go embellish, add in scales, add in runs, do whatever you want with it. And that's amazing that a composer would give you that sort of freedom. But the majority of them, give you exactly the notes, the phrasing, the dynamics, the nuance. Like they write down most of what they want. So if you take the time to not just look at the score, well, first of all, learn your part and then look at the actual orchestral score so you have a bigger sort of more horizontal view of what's going on. And then also read about the composer and not just his life, but what he was going through during the time that he was composing this specific work. It's quite fascinating, and it does change the way that you color and nuance a piece if you know more about the composer himself.
And there are indeed extreme examples of that where it's quite obvious, like Wagner and Hitler.
Yes.
Or,
Absolutely.
But people don't tend to think about that when they're with a composer like Vivaldi. So
yeah, Wagner's one, Shostakovich is definitely another one because he was composing under a rule where he had to change opus numbers and wait until Stalin died, essentially, to come out with some work that he had composed earlier and he had hidden away. You come to respect these composers, and I'm personally in awe of most of them. So I want to do my best in making sure that their message is portrayed in the truest form possible. And then also, after you're done with all that, to add in a little bit of your own personality so the audience members who come to the concert or who listen to your recordings, as soon as they hear you playing, they know that it's
that it's Sarah Chang.
Yeah, so hopefully you can put that all in one package. Now, when it comes to the U.S. Embassy's Artistic Ambassador title, I am so honored because it really has opened my eyes up to this whole other world, which is so rewarding and so fascinating to me because I do love working with children, and whether it's school children in South Africa, in villages, to Bosnia right after the war where they sent me. I was just in Ukraine, like right after the whole crisis with Russia.
Mostly focused on children?
Yes.
Incredible.
And that was something that I wanted very strongly to do, because I feel that it wasn't that long ago that I was a kid
Right.
myself, and I feel that you can have the most influence on children, you know, because they're still forming their opinions, they're still forming who they want to be as adults. And I just feel that, you know, you can really reach them in a way that is just so satisfying and so eye-opening for myself as well.
I think this whole idea of focus on children, as someone, I gather you don't really like the term, but as someone who is a child prodigy.
It's okay.
Yeah, for these children to see you when they're at a time of such despair and sort of see what's possible. And I think that must be remarkable for them as well.
What I love about the children, though, is that they're not jaded. They're not jaded, and they're still so hopeful, and they still have really bright eyes and a bright outlook on the future. And I've seen kids, I've worked with an incredible variety of students, you know, kids who literally have very little and live in subhuman climates. And those who are incredibly talented and are fortunate enough to go to music school, and they have the support from their parents and teachers to have the foundation they need to jumpstart a career. And it's quite amazing that you can go to these villages and small towns, and you know, the last time I was in Cape Town, you know, they took me to a village about an hour or so away, and the kids they couldn't take their the instruments. First of all, came from the schools, right, but they couldn't take the instruments home and back to school because the walk back was so dangerous, and they would 100% be robbed on the way. So they had to leave the instruments at school, and if they wanted to practice, they just had to get to school early in the morning and work. And they didn't have sheet music because the school didn't have fun, so they did everything by memory. These kids were playing by memory, and they're smiling and they're bubbly and they're happy, and they give you so much hope, and you can't come away from that and not be affected.
No, absolutely. To switch gears for a moment, you have, as you mentioned, a business side to your art. You have record labels, or whatever they're called these days, and assistants and publicists and all of this. Could you comment on the one or two biggest ethical challenges you have on the business side?
You know, the business side is actually a side that I do not enjoy.
Okay.
And I'm actually quite upfront.
Not surprising?
I am quite upfront about actually saying that it annoys me. I feel that I'm a musician, and what I do is I practice. I go to all my rehearsals, I go on stage, I perform, I do everything that is expected of me that comes with the performance. And these days, it's not just you play your concerto and then you go to dinner. It's not that anymore. Now it means you do meet and greets, you meet with the donors, you do all the donor functions that are required of you, you do Q&As with students, you do CD signings, you do autograph signings, you do everything and anything that is required of you to make sure that everyone who's at the concert and all the audience members feel that they are a part of your lives, and that I can also express my gratitude to them, because I realize that they all have choices. You know, they could stay home, they could go to the movies, they could go to dinner, they could watch Real Housewives on reality TV, they could watch the Kardashians, they could do whatever they want.
In today's world, even if they wanted to watch classical music, you know, everybody has everything at their fingertips at home.
Exactly.
So that's quite interesting. So what, you mentioned the word annoyance, and I can completely understand that. What is particularly annoying to you about the business side?
Well, I think on a day-to-day basis, it's just a sheer amount of emails that fly back and forth. And I'm very grateful to have an amazing team. They are probably the best people in the business taking care of me, and I'm very, very grateful for them, because they really do make my life run in an almost seamless way. You know, I have people who take care of me in the U.S., then there's a European team, and there's the Asian team, so they all talk to each other, and only very, very rarely are there ever hiccups, and even that is incredibly rare. So they are the best people in the business, and I'm very grateful for them. Having said that, you know, there are, you know, issues that occasionally pop up that, you know, they can't all take care of on their own, because they, you know, it is my life at the end of the day. As for someone who's a musician, you know, and someone who generally loves to be on stage and to perform and just play. It's the best part, you know, it's the best part. And everything else, to me, is just white noise. You know, so if the white noise takes up too much time, then I just
Has there
get a little
been
annoyed.
more than white noise? Have there been actual real ethical challenges in the business side?
I think, surprisingly, no. Surprisingly nothing too harsh. I think if I had started my career out a little later, I probably would have encountered some issues, just being the sheer fact of being a female performer on the circuit in a very male-dominated world, you know. And most conductors and most, you know, presenters and promoters are incredibly respectful. And in my case, I started out when I was a kid. So I've got history and I don't need to play that game anymore. But I do feel for some of the female
who start later in their careers.
Later, and they may be compromised in a way. And also, like, you know, management and record companies, and you know, you may think that this will change your life, but at the end of the day, my philosophy always was that if they invited you here, if they want you now,
right,
you know, and if you say no now, they will invite you back. That is my philosophy, you know. And
again,
if
you can say no.
Yeah, exactly. You know, just as long as I think you learn how to say no, it really does simplify a lot of things.
So if we broaden the lens beyond the business and even beyond your art, what do you think is the biggest challenge, ethical challenge that society faces today?
I think balancing the artistry of the music world with the necessity of the economic world. And I don't really know too many musicians who love the business side. A few do. A few do actually enjoy the business side of running things, but most of my friends and colleagues, I would say, you know, the majority of them don't. But, you know, unfortunately, it is necessary. We do have good people, good accountants, good business lawyers taking care of us, but I think at the end of the day, it really does go hand in hand.
And if you look outside the music world, or even outside the world of arts, what out there in society, when you open the newspaper or you turn on the news today, what are the one or two ethically related challenges that make you really say, wow, that's the worst thing we have to deal with today, that's the most challenging thing we have to deal with
today?
I
think at this particular point, there's no job like the presidency that seems so repulsive right now. Right. I can't imagine why anyone would want that job at this point. And I feel
we're October 30th, and the election is 8 days away.
8 days away. We're 8 days away, and it is, you know, I am almost scared to watch the news now, because every day there has been another bombshell, another, you know, scandal, something else. So I almost want to stop looking at the news now.
And with your family roots in South Korea and your international career, I think you're probably more aware than most of how important the U.S. presidency is globally.
Oh, it completely is.
Beyond
I mean,
the U.S.
You know, the spearhead. You know, I mean, the U.S. really, we do lead the charge in almost every sense of the word.
So since we're on the topic of the election, if you had to recommend to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton some piece of art, it could be a work of literature, it could be a piece of music, it could be a painting, that they should see, read, watch for an ethics lesson, what would you choose?
Well, I think someone should take away Donald Trump's phone. I think he just needs just to chill for a second. And I think someone should take away Hillary's computer. Right. I don't know. Technology is not, I don't think it's their friend right now.
And I think a lot of people are getting themselves into trouble with technology.
Yeah, and the thing is, you know, at the end of the day, we all have something that we're probably not particularly proud of, but then again, we're not all running for president. Right. You know, so I mean, we can't live without our phones, and we can't live without, you know, our computers, but we can choose to, you know, pick our words a little bit more wisely when we tweet something or put something up on Facebook or anything to do with social media. You know, it's our choice. We don't have to be on social media, you know? I mean, I have somebody at my management, you know, who helps me out with social media. And I'm not running for president, you know? So if somebody like me, you know, has some help, then, you know, then why not get someone a little more qualified
than 3
a.m.?
So if we could delve into this question of science and technology and music, in particular live performance of classical music, what do you think has been the influence of a very science and technology infused society on classical music? Because I've read wonderful quotes from you about how classical music doesn't use microphones, doesn't necessarily need lighting, isn't being kind of photoshopped, to use the word generally, by any form of technology. Do you think science and technology is important for music today, or do you think that the real focus of music still needs to be looking at the composer's intention and staying true to the instruments and the legacy?
I think 100% we should be focused on the music itself. The music itself, the instrument itself, the composer, I think is plenty. It can be so enriching and so fulfilling just by itself, and you don't need the microphones, you don't need the extra lighting, you don't need the laser show. And especially when it comes to, to all this amazing technology that you have in it. And, sometimes you see it now, even in the classical world, where they not only try to mic you, but they have all these new halls that are acoustically adaptable. Meaning that they can raise the panels, they can lower the panels, they can open the curtains, they can close.
So they can make you something that you're not, put simply.
Exactly. And I always, and I realize that it's a wonderful option to have, because with some halls they're multi-purpose. They are sometimes used for recitals, which means there's a pianist and a violinist. That's it. Chamber orchestra, small chamber orchestra, or a full-on orchestra with 100+ musicians on stage. So I guess it would be nice to have that option, but my favorite halls in the world, the Vienna Musikverein, the Amsterdam Concertgebouw, the Berlin Philharmonic. I mean, they're halls. You don't mess with them. You don't play with them. You go, you play in the hall, and if you need to tweak your own playing to make it sound great in that hall, then you tweak your playing, but you don't start messing with the hall.
Then it becomes the responsibility of the musician, not an acoustic engineer.
And you don't want to start playing that game, because then it's like plastic surgery. I sort of feel that it's like plastic surgery when you start fixing the boobs or the nose or the ears, and then everything just all of a sudden doesn't look right because you're fixing one thing at a time. And sometimes you just need to take a step back and say, you know what, it's okay the way it is.
That's
just
a
leave it alone.
fantastic analogy. Because it's true that you wouldn't necessarily notice if, for example, adapting the volume might shift the tone, or might create an echo of some sort.
Exactly.
That's really, really interesting analogy. So speaking of being true to the legacy and to incredible instruments and to the music, you have an extraordinary violin. Can you tell us a little bit about that violin?
I am so happy with my instrument. This is a Guarneri del Gesù. It was made in 1717. So it is just under 300 years old. And I got it through Isaac Stern, who was one of my dearest teachers, mentors, coaches. I loved him. I absolutely loved him. And he was so integral to my life as a violinist and as a musician. And he just to have an instrument like that, which is a part of him, and every day I get to play it, and I'm reminded of him and the responsibility that I have as a musician to look after it and to make sure that it's in a good condition and in playable condition for the next generation of whoever might be playing it after I'm gone.
So that really is a link between the past and the future.
It really is.
It's extraordinarily beautiful instrument.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Do you have a particular work, either a piece of music or a work of literature or a work of art, that is your favorite, particularly from an ethics standpoint?
I adore anything and everything that Brahms wrote. If you look at photos of him, he looks very gruff, and he's this big guy with a Santa Claus-like beard, and he looks quite stern, but you play his music and every note is filled with so much love and so much compassion. And if you read about his life story, this was a man who had real integrity, and was such a loyal friend to everyone that was around him. He had one love his entire life. He was in love with Clara Schumann, who was married to his best friend. So that did it. That was it. He never got married. He respected his friendship with Robert Schumann so much that he never acted on that. And to the day that he died, he never got married, and Clara was it for him. So just the morals of the man, and the music that he wrote, all the symphonies, his one violin concerto. I wish he had written more, but his one violin concerto, all his sonatas. I mean, it's just every note that he wrote was just pure perfection and just beauty.
It's an extraordinary life story also.
It really is. It really, I can think of maybe a handful of writers, authors, poets, and a handful of composers who have really left their legacy, in their art, and it really is a legacy because, it's here and we're still trying to interpret them and we're still trying to master them to a point where, I'm still in awe of them.
But that's a perfect example of how important it is to read about the composers in addition to facing the challenge of the music that they created.
Yeah, and I think just looking at the notes and learning the notes is just really the tip of the iceberg, and you really can't get to the soul of every piece unless you really do some research on the composer.
So Sarah, when you teach, for example, master classes, do you find that your students come prepared, having invested in that research about the composer, about the era, about other composers of the same time when they're preparing and performing for you?
I think every student is very different. They all have their individual personalities, and there are some that play amazingly well, and they're great violinists, but they haven't necessarily done the research on the composer and getting to know the inner depths of the emotional side of the composer. And then there are those that really do their homework. Who may not be the most technically firework sort of gifted, violinist, and that's in the technical sense, but they are incredible musicians and they really want to soak up as much knowledge as they can about each and every composer. And I feel that at the end of the day, it's not about fancy fingerworks, but about being able to sort of dive into the soul of every work that you're playing and really get to a level where you can actually stir somebody's emotions. And you can only do that if you understand the piece from the inside out. And I sort of think that it's like students that you have at school, where some kids are fine just cruising by and getting C's straight through. They'll still graduate. It's totally fine, right? And then there are those who stay for extra credit, and they'll
office hours and
for those extra credit points. And it depends on each individual. One isn't better than the other. Just at the end of the day, you really need to just find out which student really just genuinely loves doing what they do.
So just as we start to come to an end here, you've mentioned technique and finger work, and you've also mentioned the soul and emotion. You seem like someone who is so grounded in your own sense of principles and in your own sense of where your commitments are and where your personal ethos is, both as a performer and as a contributor to society. What do you think is the balance in ethical decision-making for you personally, or for our leaders today, or for other artists, between sort of emotion and intuition versus actual technical thinking about, rational decision-making?
I think at the end of the day, it really is about surrounding yourself with good people, people that you are happy to admit are smarter than you, and that you don't mind going to for advice. I think everybody has a certain amount of pride, but at the end of the day, you just need one person. You need one person that you trust, that you can be completely and totally honest with, and you can really bare your soul and ask for honest advice. And whether you take it or not is up to you. But I think at the end of the day, for me, I rely heavily on my mom. I also rely heavily on my very first manager. She was the one who really helped me start off when I was 8 years old, and she has long retired, but I still talk to her because I trust her.
So this listening and taking a deep breath.
Yes, and I also feel that people who have been in the business longer than you have a lot of really good insight. They've seen it all. They've seen it all, and I really do feel that I do personally respect their experience a lot. So I do feel that, it's okay to sometimes just swallow your pride and say, hey, I need help,
Even somebody as renowned as you, look at people who've been in the business longer, or who,
Yeah, and I think it's really good to at least have one, whether it's a coach or an advisor or someone that you trust.
Sarah, what have I not asked you that I should have, or that you'd like to comment on?
I think you covered a lot today. This is fascinating for me as well, because sometimes you spend all day on your instrument and talk about music, and you sometimes don't get to really delve into the deeper issues like ethics in society and music, and what it does really for us as a well-rounded human being. And I think it's fascinating what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Again,
you.
It's been such a privilege.
Thank you so much.